Childish Gambino released his debut studio album, Camp, in 2011, and yeah, people don't really like it all that much. Now, maybe back around when it was released, it was a bit more well-received, but it seems like nowadays it's not really looked back on very fondly, and I'm here to tell you that I actually kind of enjoyed it. Now, does that mean it's a perfect album? God, no. But I do think it's better than some people give it credit for. I really wasn't planning on listening to any Childish Gambino anytime soon, but one day I was listening to This Is America thing about how great of a song it is, when I realized it's the only song by this man that I actually know pretty well. I figured I'd change that, so I found out that this was his first album, and I gave it a listen. On first listen, I thought this was pretty excellent, but I will say that it's grown off of me on more listens, for reasons that I'll get into in a little bit. But even with that said, it's a much better album than I thought it would be, given the reception. So how we're going to do this video is I'm going to start off by running through the track list and giving my opinion on each song, much like I did in my Donda 2 review, and then after that I'll just kind of recap by going over my general likes and dislikes on the album, much like you'd expect in a quick review that I do. This isn't going to be a super long one, but I thought it'd make for an interesting video, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. Let's get into the review.
I used to dream every night, now I never dream at all.
I think that Outside is an excellent opener to the album, and is honestly one of my favorite songs on the whole thing. The instrumental was one of the few moments on the album that felt very Kanye-esque to me. It just felt like he listened to Dark Fantasy and wanted to do something similar to his intro. It's all very big and grand and a very epic start to the album. Something else this song succeeds greatly in is setting up a lot of the themes that run throughout the rest of the album. The biggest one being that he doesn't feel black enough, and he's not really accepted into the black community because he grew up somewhere different, and something he brings up a lot is how he's perceived different by the black community, but they're all looked at as the same by people outside of it. I think this is an interesting topic for him to bring up on this album, and it absolutely 100% will not get annoying and ran to the ground by the end of this album.
And if you're feeling how the world should be perfectly on fire like a third degree.
On first listen, Firefly was actually one of my least favorites on the album, but as time has passed and I've listened to this album more, I've really grown to appreciate it for what it is. I think it's solidly written and pretty much just carries on the same topics from Outside, but in a much more uplifting tone, which is pretty nice because that's not really a tone that we get much throughout this album. One of the biggest hangups for me initially was the chorus, which I thought was really cheesy and over the top, and I still kinda do, but I've learned to accept it more on repeat listens. I think that although it's a bit cheesy, it really adds to the overall uplifting vibe that the song has. While the song isn't perfect, I really like where it fits in the album, and it's nice to have a bit more of an uplifting moment.
And Adidas with some short shorts, B-O-O all over me. My green is where it's supposed to be, your green is in my grocery.
I don't really have a ton to say about Bonfire. It's definitely the biggest on the album for a reason. This is one of the most hard-hitting songs here, and probably has my favorite instrumental on the entire album. It's a mostly really fun song with some super clever lyrics and an incredible delivery and flow. It's just a really great track, and while I don't have much to say about it, it's probably my second favorite on the entire album. Also, here's some slightly off-topic trivia about this song. Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas both love the song, and she said that Camp as a whole is an incredible album. So would you look at that? All the Shine is a weird one for me. It's a solid song and it's pretty well constructed. It's just one that I never have any interest to return to outside the album whatsoever. I think a lot of that comes down to it just not being all that memorable. I think that it hits a lot of the same buttons for me as Outside, just without being as good and memorable. I like the instrumental a good bit, and his flows and lyrics are all fine. They just don't really stand out when put next to the rest of the album.
You're the only girl that I have ever wanted.
Letter Home is a really nice little interlude to throw into the middle of the album. It feels a bit like a continuation of All the Shine musically, just more interesting. This is a pretty short and straightforward interlude, so I don't have much to say about it other than it's nice and I like where it fits on the album.
I wanted you to know that I am ready to go. Heartbeat, my heartbeat.
Heartbeat is the second biggest song on the album, which makes just about as much sense as Bonfire being the first. I think that this takes the album in a very different direction for a little bit, and I think that it was a very interesting choice to put this right after Letter Home. The song does a really good job of detailing this toxic relationship, and it does it over one of the best instrumentals on the entire album. This, much like Firefly, definitely took some warming up to, but after a few listens I understood why it's one of the most popular and acclaimed songs on the album.
Running this thing, money insane, busy getting brain like crank.
Much like Bonfire, I don't really have much to say about Backpackers. It's not my favorite on the album, but it's pretty solid, and it's interesting enough to stand out from the rest of the album. It's basically a song devoted entirely to calling out all his haters that he's accumulated throughout the year, and it has some clever wordplay with a decent beat to go along with it.
A New York 9s and everywhere else 6. Time-wise, the opposite goes for chicks.
Les, I think I'm just going to assume that's how you pronounce that. I may be completely wrong on that, but regardless, Les reminds me a lot of Heartbeat, and it hits a lot of the same buttons for me, but I am kind of torn on which one I like the most. I like that Les has a bit more of a sense of humor and is used well to alleviate some of the more serious moments. On the other hand, I don't really think that Les is as memorable as Heartbeat, especially on the instrumental side of things. I think that I'd probably have to pick Heartbeat if choosing between the two, but I do really enjoy Les a lot. Now here's where some of the serious flaws of this album start to show. This song is far too long and has no reason being the second longest on the entire album. Also, the instrumental on this thing is super underwhelming to me. I think that it just sounds like a less interesting version of some songs that appeared earlier on the album. It's well made on that front, it's just so forgettable. And this is also where I start to get a bit sick of the point that I brought up earlier when talking about Outside. I think that him being insecure about not being black enough is interesting as a topic, and it could have been pulled off consistently, but at this point in the album, I'm practically begging for him to switch it up. Almost every song on this album, to this point, has been about this very topic, and it just gets annoying and tiring after a while. Hold You Down isn't my least favorite on the album at all, but I just think it could have been completely cut and the album wouldn't be any different for it.
Keep up, keep up, keep up, keep up. That's all I want, keep up.
Kids is probably my least favorite song on the album. Much like songs earlier in this album, the singing and the instrumental are pretty cheesy, but this time they actively work against my enjoyment of the song. Along with that, this is where some of the lyrics really start to rub me the wrong way. Like, there are some weird lines throughout this album, but this has to be the worst offender. I've tried to enjoy the song on more listens, but the more I hear it, the less I care to sit through it.
I'm on my ballin' each and every day. Asian girls everywhere. You see LA.
You See Me is a bit of a weird one for me. It's fine, I guess. It just doesn't really hit the same as Bonfire, which I feel like it's trying to. I think that beat is kind of fun, even though it's extremely generic, but what really drags it down for me, just like the last song, are the lyrics. And this is when I really started to notice how much he likes Asian girls. He mentions it multiple times throughout the album, but this is the first time where it really stood out to me, and it comes across as pretty weird whenever he talks about it.
What do, bitch? Why these other rappers do shit, stupid?
I like Sunrise a lot. It's not a super memorable song, but it has the same energy that the first few songs had, and I wish that more songs had that. It's pretty uplifting and fun, and it's a nice song to have in this pretty shaky second half.
I know you got that power.
So how do I even begin to talk about that power? This is the closer on the album, and it beats out Bonfire for my favorite song here. The song itself is great, and it ties up a lot of the themes on the album without being all that annoying. I also think this is another beat that's among the best here. So yeah, that's all great, but then the last 4.5 minutes are entirely devoted to a monologue. This monologue is literally perfect and is by far the best thing on the album, and it's also met with an incredible beat switch. The whole monologue is incredibly done, and I think it wraps up the album very nicely, but it does kind of leave me wanting more from the album as a whole. I think this ending would have hit even harder if it was more of a concept album, which it very much wasn't, and I think that that's a serious missed opportunity. Regardless, this song is phenomenal, and it's the best thing that Camp has to offer, in my opinion. So now that I've finished briefly talking about every song on the album, I'm going to take a little time to break down my general positive and negative thoughts on the album. I'm not going to be spending a long time on these, so yeah, just like I said, this is going to be a pretty short video. The first thing that stuck out immediately to me on first listen were the beats. This is a really well-produced album, and outside of a couple songs that are generic or cheesy, the beats are mostly incredible. I mean, just look at songs like Outside, Bonfire, Heartbeat, and That Power. These are all masterpieces instrumentally. Next, I want to say that the main topic he keeps bringing up throughout the album is an interesting point of view, and it leads to some different perspectives that I enjoyed hearing about. We'll get into more of the issues with this later, but just know that as a concept, I did like it, and I think it's pulled off really well in some songs here. Something I didn't really bring up much when talking about the tracklist was Childish Gambino's insane flows and deliveries all over this album. He comes across as extremely skilled and creative throughout this album, and it honestly just makes me really excited to hear him on later albums. If this is how good he was on his first album, and this is supposed to be his bad one, then I can't even imagine how good he must be on Because the Internet. Lastly, I want to say that I saw someone defend this album by saying it gives off the fun, carefree vibes of Camp, and I kind of agree. I think this album really succeeds in what it was going for in that area. My only issue is that I think it could have gone even further with its ideas. With all that out of the way, let's get into some of the things I disliked about the album. While I do have a good bit of praise for this album, it's very, very far from perfect for me. And while a minute ago I did just praise the instrumentals, at the same time, when they get boring and generic and cheesy, that becomes one of my least favorite things about the entire album. It's rare that this happens, but it does happen, and it gets really underwhelming when put up against songs, like I said earlier, like Outside, Bonfire, and That Power, which all have stellar instrumentals. All the beats were mostly solid, but there were moments here and there where I felt like the production wasn't as good as it could have been, and it could have went a lot further with what it did. But that's only really on songs like All the Shine, Hold You Down, and You See Me. I think the biggest problem here that's pretty consistent across the whole album are the lyrics. There are some songs that are excellent lyrically from front to back, but almost every song has a weird line of some sort. But I mean, I listen to Kanye, so I'm no stranger to that, but the problem comes when there are songs where the lyrics get so annoying and so uncomfortable that it becomes impossible to ignore. The two big ones that stick out to me being Kids and You See Me. Some of the things he raps about kind of reminds me of old Tyler the Creator, and if you've seen my Tyler video, then you know that I'm not really a fan of Tyler's Goblin era, and the way that Childish Gambino uses certain lyrics on this album reminds me of that type of Tyler, just really annoying, over the top, and obnoxious. I also think that the main theme of him not feeling black enough gets really, really overdone by the end, but like I said earlier, I think that it works more times than it doesn't. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Childish Gambino's Camp. I actually really enjoyed it compared to how it seems most people view it, and I'm gonna give this album like a decent 7 out of 10. And yeah, I'm just stealing Fantano's scoring system for albums because I think it works well. So yeah, this is a pretty short video that I just decided would be fun to make, so hopefully you guys enjoyed watching it. Before you go, I do want to bring up a couple of things. First off, I'm curious if any of you would be interested in watching videos that were like my first reactions to certain albums. I was thinking of trying it out with because of the internet, and then after I let the album sit for a bit, I'd make a video on it similar to this. Album reactions have been some of my favorite YouTube videos to watch recently, with a couple of my favorite channels being like Turning the Tables and Path Reacts, and I think it'd be fun to experiment with that type of video, so let me know if that's something that'd be interesting to you. I also want to say that I am working on my review for Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. It's just taking a while because there's so much to take in. It will for sure be out sometime this weekend, so stay on the lookout for that. I think that's all I really got to say, so let me know what you think of Camp in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next one.